Welcome to the Inside Track from Barndoor Strategy, making sense of public affairs and public policy.
Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be looking at preparing for select committees, and I have an expert duo from Barndoor Strategy here. Select committees can be quite daunting, I think. The idea that you're there in front of the public eye and every single statement you make is going to be sharply scrutinized for accuracy, and they do of course have some quite daunting powers. I mean, they can summon you and force you and compel you, although that's relatively rare, I believe.
Yes, because a lot of people believe, and perhaps rightly, that it's actually an opportunity to appear before a select committee. I mean, Roger, you've had many experiences running committees, running scrutiny committees. How do you find that it works?
What I find is normally people who appear in front of a select committee actually appreciate the opportunity to be able to state their case and to promote the organisation that they represent. And it can be a very important moment in the timescale and the growth of an organisation, particularly newer organisations, newer companies, if the person who's running it is invited to give evidence to a select committee, because it gives them a platform that they wouldn't otherwise have. Conversely, of course, if things don't work out so well, it can be a disastrous moment, and that's why preparation is so essential.
Why would a client be called before a select committee typically?
Well, usually a select committee will already have decided the subject that they're looking at and the evidence they will ask for. And at first, people will submit written evidence. And if the select committee find a piece of written evidence particularly useful, they might call you as the person who created that evidence to come and speak to the committee in person and answer questions. And that's probably the most common way to get called to a select committee. On other occasions, you might find that you're called in front of a select committee because you've already had publicity around the particular subject that's being discussed, or because you're seen as an expert in that field. And occasionally, if you've got particularly publicity-hungry select committees or select committee chairs, they might invite you because you're a well-known name and you can actually promote what they are doing. So sometimes this works the other way around.
I mean, the publicity-seeking part is quite interesting, because the motivations of different MPs on that committee will vary hugely, not to mention their politics. And is it fair to say that they can differ quite a bit in how different MPs on the same committee treat the witnesses?
Well, I always say with select committees, if you're prepping for a select committee, you have to bear in mind that there are three different types of agenda in the room. First of all, there is the official agenda and the questions that are going to be asked, because select committees plan their activity. They don't just turn up and talk in a room. They will have things which they are looking for, which they're going to ask for. And it may very well be that if you appear in front of a committee, that agenda will be partly known to you. You'll know what the objectives of the exercise are. You might even know what some of the questions are if people share that with you. And sometimes they do, because they want to get the best information from you that they can, and they want you to be able to research it. But beyond that very public agenda, there will be a second agenda, what I call a political agenda, where political groups on the committee are trying to get you to say something which supports their political policy. So you might get a question from a political group which says, what do you think about introducing this type of law or this type of regulation? And just coincidentally, it's the same thing which their political party are suggesting. And if you say something positive about it, then they can quote you as being in support. The third type of agenda, and probably the most difficult to predict, is the personal agenda. And some of the people on the committee will have their own interests that they pursue, or their own particular way of asking questions. And really the only way to be able to predict what's going to happen there is to do some serious research into the people who are on the committee and what they've said in the past and what they may say in the future. And that's probably the place where witnesses come unstuck, most of all, because they don't expect that type of questioning from individuals.
And that's where a public affairs agency can really add value, because it's our job to have the knowledge of what some of these past attitudes and issues will be, because we have a deep and long knowledge and understanding of the individuals on the committee. But going back almost to perhaps the first principles, I mean, select committees are still a relatively new part of the British constitutional settlement, and certainly the late George Jones, for example, the LSE professor, disputed as to whether select committee should ever be part of the British constitutional settlement. They're essentially a borrowing from North America, where you have the Senate committees, and we'll touch upon that process a bit later. But they've become an intrinsic part of the institution of Parliament. And certainly, from our perspective, a lot of our work is done with that pre-engagement, because a lot of them are very approachable clerks who are very keen to talk to potential future witnesses. Often they are very keen to have those questions shared, because they want sensible written evidence put in. They want sensible answers given out in committee. The worst thing you could possibly have is to have a committee and you have a set of witnesses who are sort of shaking their heads and sort of saying, well, we don't know. And you wouldn't want that. But also there's the other factor as well that's worth bearing in mind, is how much it's a collective institution. And those members of the select committee do work together as well as act as individuals. And there's a balance there, as you may well find that, say, Fred will be given the questions on a particular topic, not just because Fred's interested in those, but because those questions have to be asked by someone. And when they have their pre-discussion, he's probably the best place to do it. Or, Gwyneth might be sort of asking a different set of questions because she's got more form in that. And so there is that sort of structure as well that goes on. And it is, particularly as the Parliament continues, select committees do start to function as one body, and there's a real collegiate atmosphere.
Always fitting into that constitutional point, there are other groupings as well that are even more novel and new in that sort of thing. So select committee type hearings by APPGs, by extra parliamentary groups, which will have a parliamentary component and an extra parliamentary component as well, but they all fit into that wider ecosystem of very public inquiries.
That's right, and all party groups have increasingly started to go down the select committee style route, simply because it's actually quite an effective way to look at a policy issue and to generate something substantive on behalf of the APPG, because people don't want talking shops. There are plenty of opportunities to talk on issues. People want results and outcomes, and how to demonstrate an outcome, but by having a report that you can publish, and potentially perhaps even some action points that you could then undertake and use. But that is why you've seen the development of APPGs looking at things and behaving a bit more like select committees. And you've also had then the development of sort of quasi committees that sort of behave in a select committee-like manner, established in Parliament as well, but aren't the sort of traditional select committees one's really terribly familiar with in the Commons. And you have a lot of these growing up in areas like environmental policy. You've got sort of much more cross-cutting committees in existence than you had perhaps historically.
And of course, you also have scrutiny committees in devolved authorities. Now. And certainly when I was a member of the London Assembly, I chaired quite a lot of committee sessions there. And with a smaller committee and longer to work over it, we could produce some very detailed reports and pieces of work. And one of the ironies really was that if we produced something which was particularly authoritative about a London subject, we found on occasions that parliamentary select committees would visit the same subject and maybe invite us to give evidence to them. They would quite often invite the Mayor of London, of course, because the Mayor of London was a high-profile person and would give some publicity to the committee.
And there's nothing stopping you as a committee, of course, if you're running an all-party group or some other non-official type committee running in the House of Commons or House of Lords across both houses. There's nothing stopping you putting a report in the select committee and saying, look at what we found, isn't this terribly interesting? Perhaps you might want to launch your own inquiry into this.
And Roger's already made quite a strong point about how it's probably a good idea to testify rather than to not testify, but is not testifying an option? I mean, there have been cases like Dominic Cummings famously refusing to testify before various committees around the Leave campaign. He has been able to not do that, but strategically, how does that pan out?
Well, I think you have to appear in front of the committee, and we've seen people appear and then refuse to say anything. I think once you've lost the battle about whether you're going to be there or not, you really actually do have to have a plausible story to tell rather than saying no comment. Because remember, this is all on the public record, and it's it's filmed, and it can be dreadful publicity for you if you're not prepared to make your case. And so it's very important to actually think through your contribution.
And from the public affairs perspective, it goes without saying that you really should have something sensible to say, because it's your opportunity to get out your side of a particular story into the public domain. And there's nothing worse than looking like an evasive or a uncooperative witness to a select committee.
Yeah, I mean, in the aftermath of the death of Robert Maxwell, his sons, Kevin and Ian Maxwell, appeared before a parliamentary select committee. And legally, they did entirely the right thing and the most prudent thing, which is have their lawyer answer every question with, this is sub judice, we're not prepared to answer any questions before the committee. But from a public relations point of view, it was a complete car crash.
Yeah, I mean, there's a real tension there with the law, because more and more things there's been this creeping sense of sub judice reaching into Parliament, and we've seen that recently with the Speaker's announcements. And historically, you have an absolute right of free speech in Parliament. It's one of the things that goes back to the Civil War, and so this is perhaps one of the battles of our era. But sub judice is certainly one area, but also there are other areas where you get organisations that simply don't think it's in their best interest to get too involved, because whatever has happened, the circumstances, the events have been very difficult, and whatever exposition of those in public is going to bring them to greater attention and perhaps make it look more difficult. But fundamentally, if you get it wrong, you're a chief executive in an organisation, you could end up yourself having to resign. And there are plenty of instances of that.
Yeah, one of the things that we used to do with the scrutiny committees that I chaired at City Hall was quite often just to take a little bit of work off your committee members and to make the whole process more illuminating, a bit more exciting for people who are watching as well, is we would invite two sets of witnesses who were on opposite sides of the argument.
Mm-hmm.
And effectively, when you do that, one side cross-examines the other in front of you, and all you really have to do is sit there and take notes of what's going on. And that's why it's really important, if you are invited to give evidence to a select committee, to know who the other people are going to be who will be giving evidence as well. Otherwise, you can have a nasty surprise if you turn up and find a long-term opponent sitting next to you.
Are you likely to have much notice of that? I mean,
well, you should have, because when the select committee publish their agenda, they will have a list of the people who are giving evidence on it. So it's a matter of being on top of that agenda and seeing who are being invited.
Pretty quick turnaround on that to sort of work out.
Yes, and it also, of course, you do need to have a level of awareness of where everyone else around you stands. Otherwise, you could have a surprise.
And the best way to avoid these surprises is to have a good relationship with the clerk of the select committee, who'll quite often be only too pleased to let you know who you're potentially appearing with or not with, and indeed is open to witnesses to perhaps make a suggestion to the committee in terms of where their evidence might be best heard and most effective. And it's obviously not up to the committee how they choose to run their session. But
the clerk doesn't want to be accused of favouritism to any particular witness. So they'll try and make that as available as possible.
So I mean. So in most instances, your first port of call in terms of this is the clerk, but also it's also why it's important to have a look at what the select committee have been up to. Do your research. How have the previous sessions gone? Who's asked a particular type of question? What has the tone of those meetings been? I mean, the other situation you can find yourself in is you might not be immediately with people who might be controversial to you or who you might have some sort of friction with, but who was in the last session? How did that go? So say a select committee has in the first session and that goes absolutely catastrophically badly. You don't want necessarily to be sort of sitting out in the committee corridor oblivious to this, coming into this room afresh, with the faces like thunder from the select committee in front of you because they've had a rather difficult session, and then you're coming into that cold and don't quite appreciate what Con already says is important.
Yeah, and context in the light of what was in the newspapers that morning or what's currently happening. Quite a long time ago, I think it was back in the 90s, I was working for the Royal Mail, and we used to send the director to speak to the Transport Select Committee regularly about railway services. And we would appear alongside other large rail users. And on that particular day, we were appearing alongside people from the coal industry. And there'd just been a controversy about Michael Heseltine closing a lot of coal mines. And that meant that unexpectedly, the guys from the coal industry spent the whole morning getting a kicking from the select committee, who barely gave the rest of us any time to say anything on that occasion. So actually news events can overtake what's happening as well. So you need to be on your toes there.
But going back to the sort of preparation aspect of, well, I mean, I used to prepare chief executives at the Financial Conduct Authority for select committee preparation. And I mean, in what is effectively a mid-sized government department, it's quite an involved process. But this can be one of the most, useful and or traumatic things that that government department or regulator goes through. And you'd have a dedicated team of people in an organisation like the FCA pulling together a massive set of lever arch files on any conceivable topic which the committee could opine on, and then speaking to all the subject specialists for an up-to-date briefing. Because what you don't want to do if you're appearing before a select committee is to give them incomplete, wrong information. And certainly the advice that we have always to clients who are appearing in front of a select committee is, don't be afraid to say that you'll write to them and that you don't immediately know. I mean, don't do it too many times, but the select committee would far rather have the correct answer than what first might come to mind.
Well, it's certainly better to say, I don't know an exact figure, we'll tell you afterwards, than to say something that you think might be correct and then contradict yourself afterwards.
Which would be awful. I mean, the worst example of that, of course, was when the Co-op Bank, back in the days just immediately after the crash, the Co-op Bank appeared, and their chairman made a series of very unfortunate guesses as to what various figures in their balance sheet and various other factors for involvement in the institution might be. And this had a terribly precipitative and negative result on his future career in the financial services sector, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I seem to remember some of these figures were up by 1,000-fold. These were quite sort of ballpark. Don't you know? Aren't you the chairman?
And there is that expectation that you will know, if you turn up in front of a select committee, you'll know how much your pay packet is, and you know the general basics of what your organisation's balance and scale and structure are. And if you don't have that information to hand, you can expect a very rough ride indeed from members of Parliament.
Yeah, and you can, of course, bring experts with you to not to give evidence, but to pass you notes to help you with your answers. Those Royal Mail sessions I talked about, we would have about 3 rows of different people behind the director ready to supply information in case the debate moved away from the subject area he was covering.
And you see the pieces of paper being passed over.
You mentioned briefly the question about your pay packet. That's the classic question, which is impossible to answer in any way that reflects well. But it's also a very, very common question. I don't know if there are more of these kinds of questions where a committee that's out to get you will ask, so how much do you earn and how do you justify this?
I don't think they're actually out to get you. Quite often, I think MPs are testing their witnesses, but it's a bit slightly more positive than being out to get you. I think it's their expectation that somebody who's a chief executive of a serious organisation will have the figures and the to hand of sort of what their turnover might be, particularly if it's in the financial sector, or what their product lineup might be if they're in a different line of business. And if they don't have that information to hand, well, it's a bit of a strange thing if they're the chief executive of that organisation.
Yeah, I think it's useful if you're a chief executive of a company to have a view when you go in front of the select committee of the experience that your customers are having of your organisation, because quite often for the MPs, the only contact they've had about your company before then may be from constituents who've complained to them or who've brought cases to them, and it's a good opportunity for them to flag those cases up as well.
Yeah. There's nothing that gives you more kudos back in voting them than getting up at the meeting and banging the table in favour of Mrs. Jones, who's written to you on the 14th of March. And that side of a personal thing, it's less normal for that to come up in select committees, but you certainly shouldn't rule it out.
Yeah, and certainly if there's a sort of spectrum of views that are common, at one end there's somebody who broadly thinks you're doing a fairly decent job and will give you the benefit of the doubt, all the way through to somebody whose starting point is justify your existence for me.
It's a key role of select committee preparation to those attending. You need to know your facts, you need to know your organisation, you need to have a clear idea of what you wish to get across to the committee, but also you also need to be aware of the pitfalls perhaps in your organisation's position and in what you may be asked to challenge you and in a more negative basis.
And Havard, you mentioned earlier an example of a bit of testimony which created a very poor impression. What are the kind of implications and consequences that come about if a poor impression is created in front of a committee?
Well, it can be P45s all round, because it can have quite a profound effect on an organisation's share price. If it's a listed organisation, it can have a profound effect on an organisation's creditworthiness. If they're an organisation that needs other people to fund them, or if they have customers. I mean, to reach for an example from another sphere entirely, there was once a rather famous jeweller who gave a whimsical after-dinner speech to the CBI conference, which resulted in people queuing around the block to hand back their produce outside his firm. And I can't recall an example as bad as that in the select committee world, but you can easily think of examples where companies have gone before select committees and somebody said something rather unfortunate, and that's been rather impactful on the future of the people who've been those witnesses or who have represented those organisations.
And it's worth flagging up, of course, that select committees inherently are televised.
That's right.
Is something that, just because only 5 people are watching BBC Parliament, and probably 3 of them are at this table, nonetheless, it's on file.
We are in the world of social media, we're in the world of TikTok, we're in the world of YouTube. That can be cropped out and put into a 2 or 3 second or half a 30-second soundbite and beamed out to all sorts of people. And these people could be your customers, they could be your constituents, they could be the voters in a constituency, you name it, or they could be people participating in the stock market. And news reports and the traditional media will think nothing of using parliamentary material as grist to their mill to illustrate news stories if somebody said something particularly interesting and or stupid.
So, Roger, what are some of the more sort of common mistakes that people might make in there's a sort of testimony that is pratfalls to be avoided?
Common mistakes, the most important thing is preparation. So being ready for the committee and having the information to hand. Don't make stuff up. If you don't know what the answer is, then admit to that and say that you'll provide the evidence during the committee. That's very important. And try not to get drawn into personal arguments, because you might find some conflict develops. But you've got to remember to be professional throughout, because what you're doing is being screened and is available for your customers and your investors to see.
And for posterity. Yeah.
And we've sort of focused overwhelmingly on cases where a poor impression is being created, but actually, can the reverse happen? Can you turn the tables? Do you find occasionally a witness overwhelms the committee? I mean, is that a common, or even does it occur at all?
I think for a new organisation, this is a fantastic opportunity for small companies challenging an existing market. Really, there's nothing for them to lose if they take up the opportunity to do this. And also for trade associations, NGOs, it gives them an opportunity to promote their message. And select committees have been used like that quite a lot. I mean, the local government select committees in Parliament are very much influenced by the local government association, for instance, who will present their approach there on behalf of councils around the country. So there is an opportunity.
And it's worth looking at that holistically as well, because it isn't a one-bite moment for, say, something like a government association or a lot of trade associations. They can use a select committee process as a rallying cry to seek information from their members. And this can be with a view to responding to an active select committee inquiry, or indeed trying to initiate a whole new one on a topic of concern to that trade association.
Yes, and it's worth saying something about the idea of fairness, which, although is not set down in any parliamentary rules, there is a sense that you should have a sort of fair chance to express yourself. And I do wonder if sometimes there are cases where an overly sceptical inquisitor might actually alienate everyone around them, and end up people feel sorry for you if you are being.
I think possibly the classic example of this was scientist David Kelly's appearance in front of a select committee, and one of the Labour MPs kind of dismissed what he was saying and said, "You're chaff, aren't you?" and was very aggressive to him, and there was a lot of sympathy for the witness amongst the wider public, who saw the way that committee padded out, because they watched it on television, and Iraq was a big subject at at the time. So yeah, politicians have to be a bit careful about the way they conduct themselves on committees as well, because they can end up painting a pretty unsympathetic picture.
Yeah, no one wants to be a bully in that situation.
That's right.
And I mean, the great example of that, of course, is sort of out with the select committees in the UK. But when George Galloway was invited to sort of dragged before a sort of Senate committee in the United States from Capitol Hill, and gave a very favourable impression of himself, and made the venerable senators absolute fools. And you have to be very careful when you've got a very charismatic witness, because they have the ability perhaps to outdo you as a committee. And I think lots of politicians sometimes underestimate the strength of character and the fortitude of their witnesses.
And is there finally such a thing as an ideal witness? I mean, are there certain characteristics that are really likely to endear yourself to a committee, shall we say, or win their respect at least?
I think it depends what the committee are looking for. If they're looking for information, then a witness who knows what they're talking about will be ideal for them, and they'll probably invite that person back. I mean, if they're providing really useful information, they may be coming back to help out with other inquiries in future. For a committee that craves publicity, a high-profile person who is going to start an argument will be favourably viewed on that occasion, but they probably won't be invited back because they're not someone who has a depth of credibility. They're just useful for that particular political point or that particular debate.
But there is a phenomenon of select committees trying to be news and jumping on the media bandwagon. You'll see a media arc kick off on a particular issue, particularly famous or infamous person in public, and then they'll be summoned before the committee to give evidence, and the committee will try and bask in that afterglow with media attention. And that's become a sort of much more modern phenomenon of select committees in Parliament.
Well, thank you very much. That's highly informative, and join us next time for The Inside Track.